I wanted to thank you very much for joining me today to talk, primarily about Gerhard Richter and your responses to his work, but also to make some correlations and maybe some threads of common interest between the two of you, even though you're separated by a number of generations, nationalities, and color, actually, too. So I wanted to dive in just quickly and immediately and ask you how familiar you are with Richter's painting.
When I first actually became aware of Richter's work, it wasn't until I was in grad school because of my own kind of life trajectory and experiences with art, which was pretty limited up until I entered graduate school. I was mainly only actually aware of like the work of Jack Whitten, who's immediately came to mind when I first became aware of Richter's work. I thought a lot about Jack Whitten, but I literally started to think about what it meant. I did a painting actually in graduate school that was a self-portrait. I remember the moment actually somebody told me about his work for the first time, and I pulled a chunk of the paint across and I blurred my face in that painting. And I remember having a studio visit shortly thereafter where somebody said, "Oh, you've got to look at Richter's work. I'm not sure if this is a thing or an one-off, but it's worth diving in because I think that you're in conversation without even knowing it." And that was the moment that I first had an opportunity to really kind of do, as you say, the forensic work of understanding his work and my relation to it or not, and thinking about those juxtapositions.
Why did you, as a matter of interest, make that gesture and blur your self-portrait?
It's a good question. I think at that time, quite frankly, it was towards the end of my first year, and I was deeply overwhelmed and potentially depressed. I was kind of the imposter syndrome of being in a graduate program, having not attended an art school previously, was hitting me pretty deep. And I was doing a lot of self-portraits at that time. And I was, if I recall correctly, I was wearing this hoodie that was a National Urban League hoodie that my mother had given me in reference to my grandfather specifically. And yeah, I think I was just feeling sad, and there was an erasure I was trying to kind of mimic in the work that I was feeling in my own day-to-day existence, that I was thinking about kind of the spread thin notion of my own existence at that time. So it was an intuitive gesture that then I think through kind of secondary impulse and thinking and observation, I was able to kind of distill what that impulse was about.
You have a number of commonalities in the practice that you have along with Richter, figuration and photography being two very important connections between your work. Here we have an image of actually a quartet from an even larger series of paintings that Richter makes in the mid-90s of his wife and small child, not the first child he's had, but where he engages in a variety of different types of approaches to the topic. And I put these four together because they are so different and they are so experimental and play with cliché to some extent, but also perhaps make a sort of deliberate attempt to subvert the traditional imagery of a mother and child, but also to subvert the beauty and sublimity of that kind of portraiture. Whether through your own practice of portraiture particularly, not of these kinds of tropes necessarily, I would ask you, I don't know whether that's true, but whether your own practice has demonstrated that kind of degree and scope of interrogation of the image to a certain extent, but also a kind of the freedom with which you may feel you can really experiment and deal with that subject matter in many different ways.
Yeah, I think there's been a real kind of breadth of my sense of discovery and relationship to just like looking at this image of mother and child and seeing the like variation, as you say so beautifully, in the way that they're rendered and the conversation that he's having with art history and the notion of a mother and child. There was a painting of mine, God Bless the Child, that was exhibited in K.C. Kaplan's most recent show, and the show that I had there called The Practice of Freedom, that I think as I saw these images, my first thought was back to my painting, God Bless the Child, thinking about the mother-daughter relationship and this kind of this cuddling that's happening and this protection. And then what does it mean to represent that through the two-dimensional form of painting and the act of painting? And I think a lot about the way that Richter goes through the actual process of making his work and the labor that goes into making these. And I was reading about how he doesn't necessarily think of them or want them to be these like empathetic spaces or paintings. The painting itself isn't meant for empathy as much as it is meant for a dissecting of our understanding of the image in its historical context and its relation to now, that there's an obtuseness that he's interested in, that it's not named after his wife and the name of his child, it's S with child, that there's a certain amount of distance that he provides through the captions themselves. And then with the image that we can relate to the sense of like being coddled, or we recognize it as a mother, or there's a tenderness within it, but there's a lot left unknown. And then the gesture across the canvas in some of these that literally changes our, it's almost like our sense of knowing suddenly has been obstructed. we're left to be uncertain about what it is that we know through the kind of the gesture, the vigor in which the gesture is made. It feels aggressive to some extent, that it's a scraping, which then brings me back to thinking about him and making that work and what his relationship is with the image itself, not necessarily the people within it, but the person making that image and their relationship with it as a whole.
What you're putting your finger on from a very different point of view is the relationship. You use the word real, and you use that word quite a bit when you're interviewing and when I've heard you talk. And I'd like to, can I prod you a bit on that?
Yeah.
I'd like to know how you define the real, particularly as you engage with the same multi-layered process of beginning with a photograph that you take or he takes, and then you progress to painting. And so the notion of real connected with photography has a very different connotation when it comes to painting.
Yeah, absolutely. The photograph itself suddenly becomes a mode of detachment from the real. And I definitely...
Detachment.
Yeah, it feels like it creates a separation between, it becomes a memory space as opposed to a physical representation of a time spent together. Time changes in a photograph. Our sense of time changes in a photograph. There's a stillness that evolves that no longer allows us to see what was happening on either side of the frame or above or below, that we lose a certain amount of context once we're only living within the frame of a photograph. When I first started using the photographs, I really struggled with that, actually. I thought, and was aware, I was thinking really explicitly about how the change occurs from the moment that you snap a picture and then walk away from a moment with someone, and whether realness shifts in time and place once I come into the studio and try to recreate from that image that moment in time. That if I think about what realness means to me, because you're right, I do use it quite frequently, even in the context of my own friends or the way that I relate to the world around me. It's like I'm always seeking that which feels the most real to me. And in quite frankly, yeah, the photograph is a detachment from that. And I think through my painting practice, I've manipulated different ways to approach the act of painting to try to bring me back to something as closely related to realness as possible. But it is a really interesting kind of like challenge, really, to be a portrait painter and to acknowledge that technology has entered itself into my practice, and whether or not technology can in fact hold the real. I would argue that it can in some ways, that there are ways of using technology, even right now, that this is, you and I were having a real, and I feel like really connecting through a computer screen, potentially miles away from one another, but we can still in time, through time and kind of reflection, share a moment that feels real and authentic. And I think painting has the capacity to kind of do that through whatever means that, like for Richter, for example, the labor of making the photorealistic portion of the painting that sometimes then gets destroyed. I feel the love that goes into that. For me personally, that's what I see, whether that was his intention or not. And the same goes for mine. You see my hand quite vigorously portrayed throughout the work itself.
I noticed that when you, your email sign-off is a quote that goes like this: "I am not anxious to be the loudest voice or the most popular, but I would like to think that at a crucial moment, I was an effective voice of the voiceless, an effective hope of the hopeless," which is a quote by Whitney Moore Young Jr., your grandfather, a great civil rights activist and leader, and who died at a tragically early age. In some respects, those words are similar to a portrait. They immediately speak to your endeavor, as well as his endeavor and your family's endeavor, and the fact that you grew up in a family and surrounded by the awareness of the inequities of society. Now, that is, I think, you know, as you have said many times too, key and central to your own painting practice. And what I'd like to do is to go back to the first photographs that they were taken in 1944 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. These are documents, essentially. They record an image that actually is fairly unique. They are the inspiration for this entire series of works called the Birkenau series by Richter. And I wanted, in a way, to start with these because they mark a particular time, but they also mark the passage of time between the perpetration of those acts that were then documented by those photographs. And now in 2020, we see these as paintings that were made in 2014, 6 years ago, which is, in Richter's life, an enormous period of many decades between the time that he first encountered those photographs and the time that he then felt able to reckon with the legacy that was both a personal one as well as a collective one. And so, you know, in dealing with the inequities of human beings against other human beings, a history of violence, of murder, and of extreme prejudice. And I think, you know, both you and Richter deal in your work with these very difficult histories. So Black Lives Matter still has, and civil rights and civil equities still have an enormous way to go. And here you are, again, you know, at the forefront of this, trying to make sense of it in your paintings and also trying to change it, perhaps. And I guess that is my question to you, which is, you know, how far do you feel painting or any sort of cultural practice is able to inflect, inform, and even change this kind of dilemma that we still have, this same injustice that we still have in our present?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pulling from my memory a conversation or a moment, maybe in the documentary of Richter, talking about what it means to kind of represent images of this capacity, especially of such pain and horror, and then to, as you say, reckon with them kind of intimately. There's this beautiful moment in the documentary, which I think is quite beautiful, where he's struggling through a painting, and the documentarian kind of asks him why it is that he's finding such a hard time. And he acknowledges that it's all of a sudden the personal, that he feels exposed. He feels exposed in his process of reckoning with the actual act of painting, and what it means to be a painter, and our own flaws, and the mistakes or the flaws within making a painting, and what it means to make a painting. And that's a part of his abstractions, yes. And thinking about the Birkenau, which on first glance, again, it says one thing, right? Without knowing the context and the history and the struggle, that if I were to approach these canvases for the first time in a gallery without knowing what it would mean to stand in front of these paintings, what would be the general feeling? What would they be trying to tell me as I approach them in that space? And what does it mean to me as a young Black woman living today? Specifically, how can I relate to what story he is reflecting through this work? And I think as a painter and as someone who has dedicated these early parts of my life, and what I hope will be the long parts of my life as well, to using paint as a form to articulate the way that I'm seeing the world around me, past, present, and future, that I'm using paint as my love and pain language. It is my journal, it is my diary, it is my everything, it is my exposed self when I am making painting, and especially if and when people are watching. But I do think it brings us back to the beginning of our conversation about time and how painting articulates a different time than a photograph, that we as painters have to spend a certain amount of time being really thoughtful about what our gestures mean in relation to the images that we are trying to represent, and how we think that those gestures will be articulated to someone who approaches them. What is it that I want them to feel or think or be involved in? And for me, as somebody who is, yes, very much a part of this legacy and this lineage of my grandfather, and what it means to be Jordan Casteel, the granddaughter of Whitney Moore Young, growing up, was something that was just embedded in my body. So there's a way through moving through painting in which I feel very similar, that it's not necessarily about what I'm representing, which is very intentional in that I'm choosing communities of color or communities that I feel the most affinity towards and the most need in their representation in the greater historical context and the spaces that I'm trying to occupy. That is true. But it's also about me as a painter and the values that I have to put into the painting itself. So every brushstroke for me has to hold a certain amount of love, which might feel different than Richter, that the empathy feels really important, because in the context of bodies that look like mine, there's been very little empathy given to theirs. And there's very little respect that's been given to theirs. And there's very little love that I feel is outwardly been kind of articulated through their bodies in the way that I think that they deserve. It spawns me to think about specifically, what does it mean to be a white man of a time reckoning with images that reference his own kind of personal lineage and history and sense of place and space, and what that pain and horror means on a universal level. That by seeing the video of Ahmed, universally all of us were allowed to reckon with the pain and horror of what it means to see a body murdered in plain blood for what we understand to be very little, if not any, reason for that life to be taken. That it was as vigorous in its aggression as bodies lay naked running through the fields, and we have no sense of what that means, that our most human parts of ourselves are true, whether I'm a Black woman seeing Black bodies be villainized and killed on the street in cold blood, or I see the bodies of Jewish communities slain in Auschwitz or in Birkenau. What does that mean? That those histories are actually quite similar. I think for a long time, I had a hard time connecting with some of Richter's work, quite frankly, because I didn't see much of myself within it. But I knew, most importantly, that I was a human, and my humanity and representing that humanity is the thing that I care the most about in the context of my own practice.
But I think during your response to me, you also talked about the stuff of painting. you have the most gorgeous surfaces. Every brushstroke, as you said, means something towards the end that you're trying to achieve. In the similar way to the Birkenau paintings, where the underlayers are literally scored out, excavated out, sort of revealed, ripped off from the top levels. And somehow for Richter, the act of painting, just as it is for you, is one which is almost a metaphor, not just for maybe the process of time, which is what it not just the process of actually creating the painting itself, but also the process of time elapsed and time and again this happens, these atrocities happen. But also it is a testament perhaps too to the nature of memory, to go back to what we were talking about before, about the nature of photography, this kind of moment that's fixed in time, and how painting then has a very different type of value in relation to time. And, you know, I'm always struck by your surfaces because they're so luscious. There's a kind of glory and joy, to use your word, in texture, in the way that every brushstroke is evident in a way that it isn't here. This is almost an erasure. One of the things that I noticed too, through not just the texture and the gesture, is of course the dynamic of color, and very often the choreography of hands. There's something mesmerizing about the way that you paint hands and feet too, but more often hands. And we have the great fortune of having a wonderful painting of 3 generations of women that has been promised to the Met collection by Tom Hill. And that's a wonderful painting, and one that we're very proud to eventually take possession of for the collection. But there is this, there is a sense when you're painting flesh, when you're painting the actual body, that the person is also getting under their skin, literally getting under their skin in many ways. And I just wondered whether you, in looking at Richter's own paintings, his figurative paintings, let's say members of his family like Betty, you know, whether you feel an affinity with a painting like this.
Yeah, I feel a great sense of affinity for what it means to then take the time, again, back to the memory and time, and to enact the act of painting onto the flesh of the people that we love, that there's a real vulnerability in that gesture. And I see that in this painting in particular. I think the angle in which her head is turned, the gaze upwards, particularly the direct gaze of Betty in this, is one that I connect to in the work that I've been making for the past few years, that there's a sense of her knowing that we are watching and acknowledging us within that frame. If one of my paintings were placed next to this painting, for example, I think the thing that would stand as difference would be our mark making as a whole. But other than the mark making, the cropping, the color, the gaze would all be held in common. And our sense of representing the people that we love and the things that we see around us is influencing who we are. Our day-to-day existence and our reckoning or acknowledgement of space around us, and the pain and the horrors that we witness, and the love and the longing that we also witness, and representing that in the two-dimensional frame for others to kind of enjoy or to long for themselves. I do see, without a doubt, significant connection. What is this Betty's head being turned like that and her neck being elongated says something very different than if she were seated kind of with her body in the same direction as her neck and her head, and what we would think and feel. There's a straining in her neck that comes with real subtlety. And I love that about paint and image making as a whole, that sometimes we're not aware of those gestures. Sometimes it is truly just that moment. But what we can pull from that moment are many different things.
I suppose I wanted to finish our conversation really by just asking you, about your thoughts with regard to abstraction. You talk about the abstracted pictorial image in some respects, portions of bodies that from photographs that you take, for instance, on the subway. But here you have a totally abstract painting. And I came across something very recently, which was by Norman Lewis. And Norman Lewis wrote in 1949, he says, "For many years, I too struggled single-mindedly to express social conflict through my painting. However, gradually, I came to realize that certain things are true. The development of one's aesthetic abilities suffers from such emphasis. The content of truly creative work must be inherently aesthetic, or the work becomes merely another form of illustration. Therefore, the goal of the artist must be aesthetic development and, in a universal sense, to make in his own way some contribution to culture."
I love that. I haven't heard that quote, but I very much relate to that sense. For me, it's this challenge of being a young woman, person of color, at a time where the language around my work wants to fall into a singular form, where it is about me as an activist, or me as a social commentary, or me working solely with a purpose to change the world, which is, there's elements of that, and the way that we all wake up and hope that, well, hopefully we all wake up and think we'd like to do something good today rather than bad. But that there is an aesthetic drive to make the work, and that I think that is true for all of us. So I often grapple with the notion that, and something I love about Richter's work is there's a permission giving in his breadth of practice and the freedom in which he feels to kind of go from abstraction to figuration, that there is a way in which he acknowledged from the beginning that if he was going to be doing a certain amount of realism, that he didn't want to be trapped within that photorealism, that he was going to devise a practice that was going to allow him to be an aesthetic kind of developing young man, that it was like his aesthetics came first in many ways. And even watching him paint in the documentary, you see the aesthetic part of it is the grounding nature in which he is making the work. And it's true with me too, that as I build the painting, I'm always trying to find balance. It is about balance. It is about color. It is about relationships. It's about the abstraction and the conceptual investigation of what it means to be a maker, which distills down into the material and the gesture and the feeling that either of those things can give or not give to the viewer. Those are my first kind of engagements with a work, always. And they're often last to be discussed or talked about in the context of my career, which I often challenge in many ways, or find challenging. That there are elements, and you're right, you probably have heard me talk about, particularly the crop paintings, I think became a way for me to think about that more explicitly, where I felt that there was abstraction within my work, that there was topography in the way that I was thinking about folds and color and light and shadow, and the way that I care immensely about the color relationships between each painting. And looking at this painting of Richter's abstract painting 2016, I'm thinking he was considering much of the same things that I'm considering about this painting behind me, that there's a lot of risk involved in representing the figure because people will want to understand the narrative portion first. But the abstraction and the investigation of the material is in fact probably the first thing that I personally am considering and reckoning. And then the narrative kind of comes along with it, that it's always going to be political because I'm a young Black woman making art and choosing to spend my time doing so. And I joke with my students about that all the time. Like, that is a political act. It is in opposition to my parents 20 years ago when I said, I'm going to be a painter. And they were like, no, you're not. That was a political act. That was a lot of risk at that time, you know? So there's always going to be a push and pull between those two things. And I can acknowledge those truths. I am aware of my body. I'm aware of the bodies that I am representing. I have to be thoughtful. I have to be respectful. I have to be knowledgeable. I have to be caring. I have to holds a certain amount of values and to push against systems that haven't made room for me or them historically. But its essence and its core is me as a painter, and my love for mark making, and my love for color and composition, and creating balance and light, and allowing the forms to kind of investigate that too.